I'd like to welcome you to University College London. Just introducing myself, just come in and have a seat if you wish. I'm Steve Chilton from Middlesex University. I'm the chair of the ICA Commission on Neocartography. This is grandly entitled the workshop for that commission, just because that's the terminology that ICA use, the International Cartographic Association, if you're not familiar with what the acronym is. It's a workshop not in the sense of there'll be a whole load of interaction with you, but there will be questions and that sort of interaction, all the presentations. You should have had a programme if you looked at the Eventbrite site, but there is 4 main speakers and 1 or 2 lightning talks, and the sessions are going to be videoed, which videos will be available through the Society of Cartography. No, they'll probably be available through the ICA blog or website that you found out the information about this particular occasion later on. So what I'm going to do is, without further ado, introduce my co-vice chair of the commission, who is Manuela Schmidt, who's with us from the University of Vienna, who's going to chair the first session. There's a tea break, which will be at the moment, it's going to be at the time of 5:10, because the speaker, Chris Watson, hasn't appeared on my radar yet, so there's a slight rejig, and Graham will be just talking straight after the tea break with a slightly extended lightning talk. So that's the only difference in the programme. So I'm going to ask Manuela to chair the first session.
For the introduction. Alright, okay, so as the first speaker, I would like to introduce Ben Hennig, and those of you who have been here before already know him. He's from the University of Sheffield, and he will talk about maps in the digital world.
Okay, thank you very much for introducing me. That looks slightly odd here, but I guess we need it for the camera. My talk could also have been titled "What's Neo?", but that title was already given out previously from Steve's talk. What I really want to talk about today is what, in my view, neocartography should probably be about. I think we're still in a sort of position to figure out what does neocartography mean, and probably sort of figuring out what do we want to achieve with something like an ICA Commission on Neocartography. And that title, From Geovisualization to Neocartography, Maps in a Digital World, is from a piece of writing which I've been doing. Well, I wrote it for my PhD thesis, but then thought, well, it doesn't really connect fully to what I put in the center of that. So it's still a sort of unpublished piece of work. If I was to tell you everything I wrote in that, I'd probably need a bit more than half an hour. So I tried to sort of put a few highlights, or picked a few, well, probably not highlights, but a few ideas of what, in my opinion, neocartography is about, or what we should be discussing about, or what is interesting about the subject, and what we as people being involved in cartography should see as a challenge. I do that. Okay, what we should see as a challenge for future directions of cartography. Okay, just briefly an overview what I thought I want to be talking about. Really, the first bit just has a buzzword, geovisualization, which is probably just another buzzword, just as neocartography is. But just to give you a few ideas of actually where are we standing in the world of mapping in general. And I put that emphasis on digital mapping because mainly neocartography, in my view, and this whole sort of talking about neo, is about digital technology and how this transforms practices, but also theoretical implications and principles in cartography, etc. I do a quick look at actually who are the ones who are doing the maps and what is map making about. This should actually be the other way around. I first have a short look at map makers. Who are the ones today who are doing maps, who are producing maps, and how are we producing maps nowadays? This is not a comprehensive overview of these issues, but really are just some sort of spotlights on these issues, which probably for the afternoon and for the road ahead of neocartography we should be thinking about. And then in the last part, I try to reflect on neocartography as a sort of introduction into the topics that we have this afternoon. Let's start off with geovisualization and a few things about terminology of actually what we are talking about. First of all, you may all have heard that notion, cartography is dead. We've heard that probably for decades already, maps don't really matter anymore. And then you may have heard that notion about actually cartography as important as ever before, and maps is a new buzzword, and everybody's doing maps, and it's all about location and location-based services, etc. And these are sort of two black and white scenarios. Well, probably the reality is we are sort of somewhat in between these two words. Probably cartography, as Crampton noted, has never been really dead. But on the other hand, this whole hype about mapping technologies and mapping techniques today that we are sort of find ourselves squeezed in, and the words of Google Earth, Google Maps, and Apple producing maps and Bing Maps, etc. This is the other side of the spectrum on a very technical side. And I come from a geographic background where the sort of GI science and geovisualization plays quite an important role in terms of terminology. Geographers who think they're doing something really important in that field of work hardly speak of cartography anymore. They speak of geovisualization, they speak of GI science and these kind of words. But what I think, this is still all basically something about cartography, and whether you see cartography as being an own discipline or as being a sort of sub-discipline of something like geographic sciences, etc. Cartography is and has always been a discipline, as written here, something that looks actually at spatial data visualization, but probably also at actually the first step that comes beforehand, at analyzing data, making sense of that data, and then turning it into meaningful representations. I personally see cartography as more as just being a map, but really as being something about visualizing spatial information. And even like 100-200 years ago, especially like in the 19th century, when the first sort of statistical methods and statistical visualizations like pie charts and all these forms of what we are using now in social as well as in pure sciences and basically in all sciences, when they were invented, they became integral parts of maps. They were integrated in maps in form, for example, like choropleth mappings, but also around maps. People like, or explorers like Humboldt, etc., they didn't just put statistical information into the map itself, but they also complemented maps, but they sort of interacted with each other. This isn't a new idea of actually sort of visualizing complex data. It was just that back in the old days, you didn't sort of have the means of digitally analyzing and sort of combining this information, but you manually had to do this process. So even if it's a bit blurry, these boundaries, I really think cartography is all about all these different words. Cartography, including geovisualization, including digital mapping, including also statistical visualizations to some extent, and we shouldn't sort of make these artificial boundaries in between. And if we see cartography as a discipline, if we want to do that or not, I don't really take a particular side in that. I'm a trained geographer, and I see cartography being an important part in that. I don't see the need for making a case for or against a special discipline of cartography. It can be part of this. It can be part of many disciplines. It can be across all areas. And cartography really goes beyond these technical aspects. It's something about aesthetics. It goes into the art field. I don't really have to tell you that, but it also goes into conceptual and theoretical ideas of actually how do we visualize information? How does it, for example, interact with the way how we are thinking? How does visual thinking in general work? And how can we actually include that in spatial data representations? But also, what kind of implications does it have actually? How do we need to treat data? What kind of statistical methods can we use to actually get the things that we eventually put, for example, on a map or in a chart or in a sort of visual form. So cartography should be really much more about just these sort of principles and techniques, but it should be about how do we actually come to the end result. And these kind of implications, to my view, aren't really all new or whatever we want to call it, but it's sort of this digital element that added another dimension to it, and that's probably the reason why we are talking about the things we'll be talking about today. So just to give a few pictures, because I won't be showing many maps in this presentation as compared to the previous one, but just to give you an idea of actually what the kind of things I had in mind when I was thinking like, okay, we want to talk about neocartography. What does it mean to me in particular? What do I make of the term neocartography? And immediately, and also in the chapter I've been writing this up, these kind of things came to my mind. Basically, everything related to neocartography was about digital, but in various forms. It was about code and statistics. This is a screenshot from the statistics package R, but also this programming tool processing, which is a sort of programming visualization tool for artists who don't have a lot to do with really the technical side of it, but want to visualize information. But also these technologies that we have on our smartphones, tablets, or whatever, like augmented reality down here, where you can sort of bring up geographically referenced information and sort of see it in relation to reality. OpenStreetMap versus Google Maps, been talking about that, for example. And digital navigation systems. This is probably why we suddenly see this sort of buzz about location coming up again. People are less and less probably using paper maps. That's a whole different debate. But they're still using maps, but is it still the same way they're treating maps as sort of the image they have in mind, or is it just something that shows you an arrow where you're going? Google Maps, Google Earth, we heard a lot about this being bad or good, whatever it be, and location-based services telling you the way to the next pub or whatever you want to know. Is this still cartography, or is it just sort of locational information that probably is slowly detached from cartography in the sense of geographic data visualization and visualizing spatial information? I sometimes have a problem with really these kind of things being about geovisualization and cartography. There's a map in the background, obviously, because I sort of need to find my way to that place. But the whole background of this is a far more technical thing of actually telling me where that pub is, instead of putting the map in the center of, or the visual element in the center of this whole thing. So, and many of the things, this is what HTML5, for example, stands for, is really about technical things. And many people get a bit scared when they see lines of code. And it may even put sort of traditional cartographers off of actually saying cartography and neocartography would be about all of this here. Do we really put that in the center of cartographic practice? Is this cartography? And I sometimes have a sense that this sort of reflection on what's behind these maps, what's behind visualizations, the sort of topical geographical background, why do we use that data, what do we want to show, sometimes gets a bit lost in this whole debate about it. Many things are about what's technically possible, but does it make sense? Do we want to do it? Some people really stop thinking about this. When I say some people, I'm talking about people who are actually producing all these products, visual products of neocartography, or whatever we want to call it. It's the map makers, and probably not traditional cartographers as we call them, but then again, what's a cartographer anyway? And just recently I came across a map, like this one here, which is an orographical map, just by chance. But I've seen, I think very recently, I can't remember where I've seen it. If you see such a map, you immediately think of cartography. And you think probably even of sort of these traditional cartographers sitting at their desk, having their tools and drawing maps. What you have in mind of people, whatever, Mercator and whoever you think of, you imagined they'd be working. Were these all really cartographers, or was cartography really just a small kind of bit of their work? If you imagine what Mercator has been doing, he didn't sit in his room all day long drawing maps. He wasn't probably even a cartographer as we would sort of, or as we have it in our mind as traditional cartographers. So I say, what is a cartographer anyway? Are there really, what we have in mind as cartographers are probably these sort of traditional cartographers. I don't know how many there are here today who are probably even trained in that profession in their courses at universities, colleges, etc., and who are doing really sort of cartographic groundwork as labeling themselves cartographers. But this has probably always been the minority. Probably the majority of cartographic output has always been produced by people who don't put producing maps in the center of their work. Many of the academic works published over decades, which include maps as a central element of their arguments, aren't produced by people who are cartographers, but who had, for example, cartographic classes as part of their studies, or who learned it for themselves. And many of these traditional cartographic courses at universities across the world, I would say, in recent decades, really started disappearing, and probably that goes back to the notion cartography is dead. Many cartographic departments have been closed in the last 1 or 2 decades, and cartography as an element of actually, for example, geographic or geoscientific studies has been sort of reduced to a minimum. If I look at many courses in geography, for example, if you see geography as one of the main disciplines really where cartography sort of evolved from, the amount of time that you spend in these courses, the number of classes you do traditional cartography, you learn these basic skills, has been reduced to a minimum and been replaced by other things which have become more important, including, for example, GIS classes, which are inevitable today to learn. But if you start your studies with a GIS class, but you haven't done any cartographic sort of groundwork before, how will you produce a sort of good map if you don't know about the basic principles? If you don't even know why your data won't open in a certain projection combined with other data because you've never heard really of map projections. So there's a problem in the last few decades that this sort of basic skills of cartography got lost. But we don't all have to be trained cartographers, and can only repeat that we aren't even all, or probably even the minority of us is a trained cartographer. And just a very few examples, and this is, I've just come across it a couple of weeks ago. I actually noticed when I actually wanted to look where is cartography being taught, where are still academic departments who have that name cartography in their title, and I actually just wanted to get that confirmation they hardly exist anymore, which is true, but I don't need to put that list up. But there are a few examples sort of a little revival of cartography, and probably these recent trends of actually mapping becoming more important again leads to a trend that probably cartography becomes a more important element, not only in terms of that we suddenly start getting new cartographic departments at universities and colleges and again, but just basic cartography playing a much more important role again in the education of people who deal with geospatial information in geography, for example, but also in other fields of science, in other practical courses. So I would probably even say the majority of people who produce maps have never been real traditional cartographers as we have them in mind as stereotypes. These traditional cartographers probably never really existed in that way. But obviously, and that is probably undisputable, people who are producing maps today are even further away from these from this image of traditional cartographers as it was probably 10 or 20 years ago. So if there has ever been a sort of traditional cartographer, it was those kind of person doing cartography 20, 30 years ago, really using or sitting at the crossroads of producing maps in a sort of manual way as well as embracing digital technology in the early days when digital technology started to really come into cartography, but who had the skills and who had the knowledge of actually how to properly produce something what we would call a good map. And that has certainly changed because back then, 10, 20 years ago, it was hard to produce a map. Well, probably 20 to 30 years ago nowadays. It was hard to produce a map, so either you could take your pencil and just draw a map, and that wasn't really something really appealing unless you were sort of really mad about maps and wanted to draw these maps. But nowadays, a map is sometimes just a click away. And that's these few examples, random examples, just to show you a little bit. And again, that notion of cartography, or this word cartography, gets more and more blurred. You will more likely find a lot of cartographic works actually being displayed under the label and buzzword, really, visualization. People are going mad about visualization, and it's really people doing maps are more like people creating visualizations. And many of these people who sort of put visualizations out there, especially if you look on the internet in the sort of community, if you may call it that way, visualization community, they do maps, but they also do loads of other visualizations, even visualizations which don't even have anything to do with sort of geospatial information. There are some people who visualize everything they can get hold of, they're interested in, just sort of moving on from one to another thing. They visualize basically information, so that's about information visualization. But these are people who are producing maps which get out in the media, which people start looking at, and which sort of contributed to the revival of maps, of our perception in that maps play an important role in our life. To some extent, because these kind of maps are the sort of iconic images that people like still looking at, and they're probably just as important as the sort of map that you have in your sat-nav that you probably use in your everyday life, even if you use that more often, or in location-based information that you're using in your smartphone. But these visualizations that you get in these repositories that link to these sort of new map makers that you have nowadays, which is a sort of quite simple label for these people, gives you an idea of actually how easy it has become to produce a map, and how easy it has become to produce a good as well as a bad map. The only thing is that people who are producing these maps, obviously, a majority of them never really came from a way of actually at least having heard of some sort of basic principles. So if you go to some of these websites like Flowing Data or Visualizing.org, well, Floating Sheep, these are an exception because these are trained people who are sort of in that field. But if you look at this, you see this sort of randomness in today's map production, and again, if you see where these maps are being published, it's on the internet, and how they get out to the public. It's again this whole idea of digital becoming ever more important in the field of cartography, being quite important. It actually, we may see it as a threat if we are map producers, as a threat to our own profession or our own domain, because everybody can do it. But on the other hand, we can see it probably as a chance that people get more interested in our work, and that we should see it as a chance of actually being part of the process. And this top left example is another element in this, why there are so many new map makers or people being interested in actually visualizing information, because that information starts becoming more and more available. And we start collecting more and more information about our lives that goes from like social data that we've been seeing, well, some of us have been seeing earlier today, but just start accumulating huge amounts of data. And actually we should probably even welcome that more and more people start using that data, visualizing it, because there's just there's so much information out there that hardly just a few cartographers could really make sense of it. And the more people sort of contribute to the whole field, probably the more ideas start coming up of actually finding new ways of visualizing information and also contributing back to the profession, to the discipline of finding new ideas how to visualize information, how to visualize geospatial information. Moving on, or actually already started talking about some of these issues already. The digital world has changed a lot the way how we are producing maps today. This is a very classic textbook example of actually how maps have evolved and how they have diversified the different types of maps that we have. And you really see sort of in the 19th century, called Golden Age of data, really these sort of diversification becoming even more important, with really statistics starting to appear as a known field and sort of statistical methods contributing back to a diversification of cartography. And then I put this really badly looking digital maps over this whole last bit, what's happening in the last decades, and put that date 1960 in here. This is around the area when computers started playing first role, first in statistical analysis slowly, and then 1960s, the first sort of prototype versions of GIS coming up, really starting to contribute to digital map projection, but also starting to actually link the two worlds of actually analyzing statistical information and then turning it into sort of visualizations and cartographic representations. Obviously that was early days, but really since the 1990s, since every one of us really can afford having a computer at home, and since even software to actually do these tasks becomes ever cheaper or even free of charge and open source, it has become accessible to anyone. If you think like 1980, for example, it was still quite expensive to put up your computer and start producing digital maps. And therefore, being a professional cartographer was quite easy if you were sort of based in institutions who could really afford setting up this sort of infrastructure. But nowadays you don't need that sort of expenses anymore. Everyone can do it, and this is why we see actually the digital turn, I would call it probably, in cartography really leading to this sort of widespread diversification, not only of map makers, but also of the way how we produce maps, and eventually of how these different fields of cartography have shaped. Because if you look in more detail what kinds of maps we're producing nowadays, that still hasn't changed a lot. You can still put it in many of the same categories as you could like 10, 20, 30 years ago. So more people are doing something, but it hasn't really led to many new innovative ideas. And what this whole field of GI science and geovisualization is about is mainly a sort of more technological aspect of writing clever code and getting sort of this in a third dimension. But it's probably a bit too far set, but with very little innovation really in terms of something really new. Many of the mapping techniques we're using today are still based on inventions from the 19th century. We just deploy it in a slightly different way, but we're still using choropleth layers, etc., and elements in maps which haven't changed probably for a long time. And another important role, obviously, in that whole sort of digital turn is digital revolution through the internet, making data available and accessible, but also actually giving us a new platform to actually bring these maps out to everyone. I have to speed up a little bit. But still, cartography didn't lose the real sense in this whole framework. It has actually made that move to the digital world and didn't do that badly. You've got like concept like type brewer and color brewer, for example, translating cartographic principles into the digital world and actually being there as resources for people who produce maps, giving advice. And these are other examples, like even producing maps can be done fully online now, buzzword the cloud, for example, and getting that sort of base information that you probably a couple of years ago you still needed to hunt down, or you needed to get access to archives and start typing off the statistics yourself. You don't need to do all that. That saves you time of actually that you could spend on much more sort of the innovative aspect of mapping, and that many of these new untrained map makers, this whole new army of people producing cartographic outputs, really spend a lot of time on. What does it mean for us? I think, or I would say, neocartography probably evolved from what a couple of years ago was labeled neo-geography. By, for example, I came across it in that book by Turner, saying there's a sort of new cartography emerging through digital technologies. And he was actually referring to digital planets, for example, like digital globes, not only Google Earth, but other digital map products, leading to a new way of actually how we sort of work in geography. But what he was really talking about was mainly neocartography. He was talking about maps and digital map making. And this is really where neocartography comes in, and to save time, this is just copied from Steve's website. I guess you wrote it yourself then, so credits to Steve. Oh no, this is Gary. Steve is coming a bit later. Gary, who refuses acknowledging that he ever wrote that.
No, I do remember now.
Now you do remember. Okay, that's good. That's good. Otherwise, it would have probably been a bad sign of your state of health slowly declining. But I actually found a quite good point in here. So good that you wrote it. But the main point here, talking about neocartography, comes in the second slide. These slides will be made available so you can slowly read it later on. Is really probably what we start talking about, why we are here today, is we should start really discussing actually what implications neocartography have. What do we have to do in future to really make it more than a buzzword of actually saying, okay, it is something new, before neocartography disappears again as neogeography. Neogeography is something that hardly anyone speaks about. But really, in order to make sense out of something like neocartography, we need to reflect on our own works and other people's works and contributions to cartography and think of where do we get from there. So what is the road ahead? And here comes Steve's quote in. That's the slide I had in mind before. We want to bring people together, but this can only be the start. But we need to sort of think about if there's really something new about cartography. Do we have something important to say? But even more, do we have something important to contribute? And this is where probably my last thoughts about sort of how do we get this digital transition turned into some more substantial words. This is one of the quotes from what I've been writing up there about digital cartography, where I try to make an argument about we have to actually look again at cartographic practice and cartographic principles. How do we produce maps nowadays, and what do we need to change to actually not only be part of the digital turn, but actually of creating and shaping the digital turn. A very simple and really bad example for that is what we could do is, for example, we could think again about, are there new ways of producing maps beyond presenting lines of cracking code that produces the greatest new visualization, but at the time it's being printed in a textbook, in a cartography textbook, this is out of date already because that software doesn't exist anymore, or whatever computer systems have moved on. Can we find ways of actually translating digital cartography into new digital cartographic principles? Is there a way, for example, that's why I said bad, doing things like putting a magnifier on a map digitally, or putting a slider on a map to actually show and reveal or hide information, these sort of, there are principles behind this. But normally what we're currently doing is we sort of present a line of code, how this can be done, and this goes in sometimes even in a textbook. But can we actually translate it into principles of digital mapping, like we used to talk about principles how a map should be created? Nobody wrote down here, use a pencil and a red color and this and draw the line like this, but this is basically what we're currently doing. We're saying this is how it's being done, but we don't try to sort of make a step away from it and make a wider point about this. And in all this, what we shouldn't forget as well is we should really stop just seeing cartography and these principles of geovisualization as a mainly technical and practical aspect, but we should really reintegrate this whole idea of actually cartography being geospatial data visualization that looks at actually what we are mapping and probably bringing it closer to the founding principles like geography, for example, as a discipline, or other disciplines using mapping. And actually, why do we do certain things? Why do we use certain statistical methods of actually visualizing and sort of connecting these words back again and have a more integrative approach in order to actually get this picture of a cartographer that was in the 1960s, our probably image that we have in mind who's drawing maps into something, or we are producing maps nowadays with having screens up, but really sort of making sense of cartography again. These were my sort of initial thoughts to sort of kick off our discussion about neocartography. Thank you very much, and sorry for slightly overrunning in time.